Okay, here we are doing the 4CS White Power fork for this in my case it's a 2016 350 SXF, and we're doing a gold valve conversion. There's the shims you get with the pack. There's the compression valve and the wee float shim and the spring and also the nut. Now on the 2016 4CS forks, from what I understand, you don't actually end up using this threaded part because they don't have the needle hydraulic bottoming out system, which is a bit confusing and a little bit of the reason why I want to do this video. So here's the base valve, which is responsible for the compression. As you notice on all the RaceTech instructions, they normally have the threaded section up here and that collar that is undone by a screwdriver or a large wedge. Now it seems to be on the 16s they don't run that, and they just run a simple nut. So I just wanted to do this video because I found it a bit frustrating, and I thought it's time for other people to possibly learn off what I've gathered. Now I've already done one fork, so now I'm doing the second fork to and hopefully it'll work out the same. So what you do is undo the nut, which I've already pre-undone. It's an 11mm nut. So take that off and put that to one side there. Here's the valve that comes standard in your fork, and the shims. I normally just put these down in the same order and just make sure you got all the shims with it. There's nothing left there. And there's the valve, and if you look closely you'll see a spring on the inside there, and there's a rather large washer which is their float check valve for the rebound. That gets replaced with this setup in the RaceTech gold valve setup. So I've got my shims pre-organised here as per my DBS, which is the digital valve system. I think it's in a system. Yours will be different. Well, I hope they will be different. I class myself as a intermediate B slow rider for motocross, and I weigh around 83 kilos. Your one will be different. My one has a crossover, your one may not have a crossover, so please ignore any of the shims if they look different to yours. Right, I'll get this set up and redo the video. Right, I've just started putting the shims on. Generally you start with the smallest one at the bottom and working your way up, and then you'll see on the top here, in my case I've got a smaller one halfway through the stack. Well, it will be halfway through when I put the rest of the shims on. That is what they are referring to as the crossover. So, and then the last shims I need, according to my DBS from RaceTech, is a stack of these, and then that then goes on top. So you'll end up with a gap or a small one in between a whole of the bigger ones. That is what they call a crossover or two-stage. Right, I'll move on to the valve. Okay, so here's my valving stack as per RaceTech, including the crossover in between, which is, you can't quite see it, but there is a very thin shim in the middle of that doing the crossover. Now what you need to do is to measure the total thickness of that. Mine is measures 2.3 millimeters. Now it needs to be between 2.7 and 3.1. So to get that thickness complete, you use some of your old shims that come out of your original 4CS stock valving. I've selected another couple of shims, the thicker ones, the 0.4s, and they need to be added to that to then get you a total thickness of between 2.7 and 3.1. So when I measure those all together, I get up to around about 3.8 off the top of my head. So the very important thing is the thick shims, what are effectively just now spacer shims, have to go on first. The reason for that is you don't want them to affect your valving stack that RaceTech recommend for you. So if they go on first, effectively they'll have no effect because the shims get slightly larger from the top, and the way they bend under the hydraulic pressure these won't affect that stack that you've got. They're just effectively spacing it up to give you the correct thickness. I hope that makes sense. So I've now got my stock shims. At the bottom here is a spacer, and then you start from the smallest going up to the largest of the RaceTech gold valves. Shim stacking suggested for you, for your individual specs, weight, skill level and type of terrain. You also might have a smaller one in between, like I say, with the crossover valve. And then you need this total stack, including the shims, to be between 2.7 millimeters and 3.1 millimeters in this case. So then put on the gold valve with the check valve washer that comes in the same packet as the gold valve. Now if I can get this up a little bit, you might be able to see underneath there's some holes. That's meant to cover those holes, and then it has to be centralized. I'll explain why in a minute. The spring goes on, the wee check valve spring, and then the nut that's provided, don't use your existing nut, use the nut that they provide because it has the special steps at the bottom to allow that check valve washer to come up. So what happens is you screw that down with the Loctite on it, provided Loctite, screw it down, then make sure that that shim in there, once it's screwed down, can still move around a little bit because it has to float up on that little spring when the oil pressures up through the holes underneath that washer and push up. So that's the wee check valve. You then have to torque it up to the recommended torque, which is written in the gold valve or in your RaceTech instructions. Okay, now we're down to the mid-valving and rebound valving. So here's the dampening rod, what they call the dampening rod, or dampening cartridge I should say. I've removed the spacer set nut at the top. That's a case of turning that nut, which is threaded and it's joined to this plastic piece here. What I've found is you've actually got to pull it up as you do it because it kind of gets stuck a little bit, but you'll work it out, it's fine. It's just that spins separately on there and it's a little bit odd, but it works out fine. Sometimes it's stuck quite hard on that rod. I only found it on this one, but you kind of clamp the rod in a part where it doesn't go through the seal. I used a rag and some pliers just on this little area here, which won't really go through the seal, to help me get that nut off because it was a bit stuck. So yeah, and then on top of that sits, in my case, a washer, this wee guide plate, and a wee spring spacer, which you have to measure if you're changing your springs later, or make sure they're within spec, but that's another story. One thing you may want to do later, or especially if you're doing the gold valve kit, is to remove this nut here off this tube here, because when you put the rebound valve back through, this wee seal slash bushing has to be wrapped around this, and the only way you can get the dampening rod, which I'll just take apart here, is the dampening rod with the factory valving and shim pack on it. The only way you can get this back into this tube, because you can't get your hands down there, if you want to guide it back up this way, is to undo this nut off this tube here. And the best way I found to do that, which I think is actually how RaceTech recommended to do it, was a bit vague, is you put a screwdriver through these two holes. I think they could recommend a number 2. Anyway, it fits very snugly. Pushed it through there and used a 27mm nut and just cracked this, what they call cartridge head, off. It wasn't very tight. It was tight enough. Obviously you don't want it to come off while you're riding, but just unscrewed that. So here's what they call the head. It does have a retainer in here which slips into this part here, and that's got like a light bushing in the end, so you want to check the condition of that, obviously, so you need to keep that. Here's the seal head. As part of the gold valve modification, they go from a 4-chamber system, that's a 4CS, to a open chamber, and from what I can gather, it means you've got to remove this blue O-ring here, which you can do by hand, especially if you're not holding a phone. And then there's a square section seal inside of there, which I, on the previous fork leg I did, just used a pick to pick it out and remove it, and then that opens up the chamber. So that's for later, but when you reassemble the dampening rod back into the cartridge with your new RaceTech gold valve, I found it easier to go back in this way, and because it's got a taper on this edge, you can then very easily guide the valve in with the bushing material that they provide on the outside without it flicking out and getting lost. So I'll get to that later, but now we'll remove the dampening, what they call dampening needle, bottoming out needle off the dampening rod, and then we can get closer into replacing the valve and the shim pack for the mid-valving and rebound. What I found here is a 14mm spanner on this nut here. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So a 14mm spanner on that nut there, and then because this is aluminium or aluminum for you Americans, I prefer to use a 6-sided socket because it's not going to damage it. So then you just crack this off. Sorry, I'm not filming this, but it will come loose, and then but still be a little bit tight to take off, because very wisely they've put a Loctite or a thread lock on there, so it won't unscrew. It'll just be a bit firm. quality video, but hey, better than nothing. So you can see that's coming off there. Let's see if we can. I'll get back to the video once I got it off. Okay, you can now see I've got that off. You can probably see a little bit of white Loctite on there. That's what sort of makes it not freely come off. Here's the dampening rod. Now this seems to be a lot shorter than all the other ones I've seen for the 4CS, and I suspect that's because mine is a 2016 model, whereas the earlier ones have a longer needle for the dampening, for the hydraulic bottoming out system. Now the wee trick in here is that there is a wee check valve inside here. As you can see, it's just fallen out. Now also part of the RaceTech valving system is they say to remove that and leave it out of the rebuild. So put that with the other one. On the compression fork leg, which this one is, this wee needle here is silver, and on the rebound it is red. And also those valves are flipped in relation to which leg they're in. So if you're doing a stock rebuild, please note which way that valve goes in the needle, because it will matter for the rebound or compression. For compression, the needle sharp point of the needle here points in the orientation that I've got it now, and when it's in the rebound with the wee red needle or cone there, it points the other way. And I think it's pretty well laid out in the RaceTech instructions, so if you get confused you can refer to that. But that is removed as part of the RaceTech gold valve setup that you're putting in. Just be careful, the shims can stick to this when you pull it off, so make sure you remove them before you reinstall, and also make sure that there is nothing left on here. So I'll pull apart this. You can see valving there. It's quite difficult. It also gets caught up on the existing thread locker there. Once again, I'll take it all off and restart the video because this is pretty boring. One thing I forgot to mention is that once you've removed the nut and you've still got your shimming on top, you're meant to measure from the top of your shimming to the top of this dampener rod. Mine was 10.5 millimeters. Not sure how important that measurement is for future, but it is when you build back up the shimming and everything. You need a certain amount of length on the top, which RaceTech provide, and I think it's around about 10.7 11 to 11 millimeters, around that range. It's written in their instructions, so you refer to that, because you probably will need to put some wee spacers to put the valve in the correct place, and also for that nut to tighten down, so just remember that. Okay, to start building the mid-valving stack, they recommend that you, well, according to my shim pack, I have to put a little washer in here, which is different from the others in the fact that it's got a 6mm ID and an 8mm OD. The reason for that is to space the rebound valve up into the correct position. Now, it's what I found on the first leg that I did, first fork leg that I did, you possibly have to pull them apart and add some more of these to get the correct length at the end here that I was talking about before, where my one was 10.5 and I needed to add some shims. So this shim here that they recommend fits on the end here and sits next to that shoulder there, and spaces up effectively, makes it longer to position this in the correct position. Now also, as noted in the gold valve instructions, this one here has a recess on one side and is flat on the other. The recess goes towards the steps. And also it pays to just check your instructions a bit further down the line before you start getting close to putting this on, as you may have to drill a hole, and you can see I've done one there, in the top section. And the top one is the one with these little blades here. You have to drill one hole to the specified size. Yours may already be drilled and may not have to drill and may not need drilling, just all depends on your thing, but it pays to do that first, otherwise you'll have little brass filings all through your forks, which is not ideal. And you can see the other side doesn't have that wee blade, it's quite nicely made like that. So yeah, that's it. So just bear in mind you'll have to do like a test assembly to get this gold valve in the correct position with the right length on top. So you may have to add more there, as I did. Right. Okay, so I've started the mid-valve shimming. I've got my shim stack in here, and you also note when you're doing your gold valve setup that they recommend a washer with a 6mm inside diameter that sits just on there, and that's to set the float when the valve is clamped down by the dampening needle. Now the float varies depending on what they recommend. In my case it's 0.4 and so what I need to do is put the recommended shim in here, which is a wee 6mm ID with an 8mm OD, so it's a very thin walled washer, and the thickness can vary as well. So how you do that is you put everything together, make sure it's all sitting, all the shims have gone over the step in the step on the dampening rod, except obviously that little 6mm one. You then let it settle down, and then you put a feeler gauge in between the shims and the valve. Now also make sure that you've got the valve around the correct way, and that's with the recess facing down towards the dampening rod, or the other way is to see that your wee hole that you've drilled is at the top. So you might have to play around with that little 6mm ID shim to get that correct, but now's the best time to do that. Okay, you can see now I've got two shims, they're just on the thread there. RaceTech recommended initially to try one, but they also do note due to manufacturing differences you may need a couple of shims. So I've added another one, and then I'm going to recheck my float to obtain the recommended float by RaceTech, which would be in my case 0.4mm, and float is that shim pack. So I've now put that other shim on, and try and check the float while holding camera. So basically it goes in between here, and if you're holding that down hard down, you should have your recommended float of the shims in there. Sorry, it's a bit hard to say, but I mean RaceTech explained it pretty well in there. They're set up, and just make sure you got that valve up the correct way, because that recess has to sit on top of those other wee shims you've got in there. Okay, so here we have the valve all done, bit debatable on the spacing on how it's been done, because I've got to put so many spaces in, but I'm happy with that. If RaceTech want to get in touch with me and tell me how to do it another way, that'd be awesome. I have tried to contact them, but they haven't replied. But that's not a hassle on them. They're, from what I can understand, a pretty good company. So the idea is you wrap that around. It gives you the piston band, as they call it. I call it a bushing. It just helps that, or it just slides that piston up and down the cartridge, and then that slides in there. As I said before, it's got a nice wee taper, so it leans in nicely in there. And then you put the guide on, the cap on with 27mm spanner, and locking it through with the screwdriver. And don't forget to remove that seal in there, that square section seal, and the O-ring. According to the RaceTech instructions, that's what's required for the open chamber conversion. And then go through their bleed and oil level procedures as they suggest in their instructions. Oil levels do change depending on the spec that they have recommended and your ability and riding style and area that you ride in. So yep, hope that helps. Leave comments, suggestions, anything that will help me or others, that'd be awesome. Cheers.